Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you are well today. At the moment that I'm recording this video, I'm not sure yet whether I'll release this video on Saturday or on Sunday. It will depend on whether I think that I will, have something to discuss tomorrow, in which case I will release this video on Saturday. It is in fact Saturday, so it will be later today. But anyway, today I'm going to discuss a topic that has been inspired by a viewer. His name is Samuel. Sorry, I slipped a little bit on that. And you'll see that his question is a very interesting one for INFJs or indeed people of any type, which is, what exactly does it mean to show a high usage of a particular function? And can that lead to confusions in maybe typing people in the correct manner? But before I move on to my topic, let me remind you that I've written 2 books recently. Thank you, Samuel, for purchasing this book. Apparently Samuel has really enjoyed it, so maybe this is an inspiration for you guys. And also my novel, The Infinite Castle, 250 pages of pure exploration of existential angst, but also topics like love and shame and meaning. Very INFJ book, tortured, alienated INFJ book. Don't know what it says about me now. Another thing that I wanted to mention is you can follow me on Patreon. You can support me on Patreon. There's already a number of you that are doing that. Thank you so much, guys. But also, of late, I have decided to also feed more sort of special content to my Patreon page. In other words, those who are my patrons will get, exclusive content, whether that be in text or in video. Maybe at times I'll share some photos and comment on them. Not to say that there will be a particular schedule for these or that they will follow a particular pattern, but I've already started to share some thoughts, and that will continue. So there will be some specific content for those of you who support me on Patreon. And, it's only €3 a month, so roughly $3 a month. So, if there are people among you guys who are very interested in INFJ things and would be interested to access some of that exclusive content, consider supporting me, and also really helps me on the channel. Okay, so what I suggest we do is maybe have a quick look at what Samuel actually says in his email. He says, I've always been curious when someone mentions that an individual displays, quote, high X cognitive function for a Y type. So that could be high TI for an INFJ type, right? That's a very good example. He says that in his case, Samuel said in his case, he's been told that he has higher FE compared to most INTPs. So you display high FE for an INTP. This, Samuel says, seems to imply that one can develop a function, but wouldn't that just open the door to a position of improving one's function from inferior to developed to mastery? For example, given you, that is Ren, me, as an example, given my educational background and philosophical approach to typology, I'm sure you've been told that you display high TI for an INFJ. I have been told this, that's true. Contrast this with a hypothetical TI dominant, so an INTP or an ISTP, who's immature in thought, unwilling to grow, and perhaps less intelligent. Would it really make sense for you to concede that this individual, the INTP or the ISTP, has higher TI or TI higher in his stack than your own? I'd assume if spectators witnessed the conversation between you and this individual, they would notice TI being more prominent in you. But if Jungian psychology is true, wouldn't their observations be incorrect? So, this is a topic that I think I have discussed before, and I'm sure that other YouTubers have also discussed before. It's a complex topic, and the more we discuss this topic, the better it is for further clarification and further elucidation. because there's lots to say, and there's a little more complications and more complexity than we may initially think. But still, I think that there are useful first few thoughts that we can consider in order to arrive at an understanding that does justice to our intuitions. Namely, that, some INFJs, maybe there are some among you, my audience, who, yes, maybe are very smart, very logical, and seem to use TI in a way that is more noticeable than the TI of people who identify as INTPs. Assuming that the INTPs in question are really correctly typed, does that threaten the Jungian model in any way? That's a good question. The first thing that is important to say, I think, is that when we discuss this particular topic, we cannot, as far as the Jungian framework is concerned, we cannot really include the inferior function in our deliberations. And we cannot really include this function, the inferior, in our deliberations, because it is very explicitly stated in Jung himself, in his works. The inferior function, and I mentioned this before, is always going to be something that is a challenge for us. Yes, we can get better at it, we can integrate it, certainly better than when it is offered to us as something largely unintegrated and something that we can be in the grip of. But the inferior function, again, so long as the Jungian model is concerned, it's never going to be a function that we become very proficient at. Now, of course, there might be some among you that will say, well, that's not true. My inferior function, I'm actually fairly proficient at it. In response to this, I think that, there is actually a couple of responses to this, because certainly there are people who will say something like this, and maybe Samuel himself, with his higher FE compared to most INTPs, might say something like this. Now, the first response is you're mistyped. Maybe you are an ENTP. You're an ENTP that is socially introverted and cognitively extroverted. And the fact that you're socially introverted makes you think you're an INTP, but in fact, when we look at the cognition side of things, you're actually extroverted. And so far as you are really an ENTP and not an INTP, higher FE compared to most INTPs is actually, there's no contradiction there. So now that would be the first thing, the first possible response. Another possible response would be to say, maybe you have higher FE than most INTPs. Doesn't mean it's fully integrated, and it doesn't mean that there is not an intrinsic and implicit limit, a wall that is meant to hit, if you like. So you could have like very, very unintegrated FE inferior, and then slightly more integrated or mid-integrated FE inferior. So in that sense, it would be higher than a completely non-integrated, but it's still not, an actual integrated function in such a way that you could be said that you have really good use of FE. That's not possible in the Jungian model. It's possible in some other models. If you're interested, I really recommend you check out cognitive type, because cognitive type or cognitive typology is a model that very much incorporates within its theory the idea that the inferior function might be harder to integrate than the other functions for a number of reasons I won't go into, but there's no reason why it can't be fully integrated and can be used proficiently, even if it's inferior. And in fact, in the cognitive type model, I'm an FE-NI user, so I'm an ENFJ, although the equivalence I don't think is correct. But what I mean is that FE-NI is a possible type for me because I be an FE-NI with TI conscious, so TI inferior but fully conscious, and with proficient use. So that's a possible type for me in the Jungian frameworks, including in Jung, including in MBTI. that's not possible, that's excluded. So I think that these would be the answers I would give in the first place. Now, in terms of the more general question, leaving aside the question of the inferior, whether an INFJ with who's smart and logical and has really good TI, would it make sense to say that they don't have TI as high in the stack as an INTP who has been described as a little bit dim, which is possible, of course. There are dim people for every type. I think that there's also a way to deal with this, this skeptical doubt, if you like. The way that I like to deal with it, because I think it works relatively well, is to say that is to really suggest a conceptual distinction. So conceptual distinction that turns out to be very practically useful and I think validated and vindicated by the usefulness of it and the way in which it can provide good and true descriptions of differences between people. The distinction is roughly, and some of you viewers will have heard this before, roughly between proficiency, right, and regularity of use, right? Maybe another way in which you could phrase the distinction is between proficiency and preference. So for those of you who are interested in this topic, I think these twin concepts that are nevertheless distinct are very useful concepts to keep in mind and to just add to your conceptual arsenal, to literally just learn them and use them, because proficiency and preference are not the same thing. Preference is relatively easy to define. Preference is a good way to identify what type you are, at least what lead function you have, or dominant function you have. The function of highest preference is the function that you always tend to go back to by inertia, in your normal everyday dealings. So someone could be, in like heavy FE mode or TI mode if they end up always being led back to NE as their inertial function, the function that whenever they're not doing anything specifically whenever there's no task that requires use of a particular function or set of functions, they tend to revert back to NE. And in this case, you can safely assume that person is going to be an ENTP. So that's what preference is. So the INTP might be dim in this case, but if their preference, if by inertia they tend to go back to a TI way of looking at things, much more than I would, because by inertia my natural sort of preference would tend to be to return to an NI way of looking at things. Well, their TI is going to be higher in the stack, and my NI is going to be higher in the stack. In fact, maybe they don't even have NI in this case, but you know what I mean. So again, it's when you're doing nothing in particular, what is your default? What do you tend to go back to by default? That actually has nothing to do with whether you're proficient in that function. Proficiency is roughly what we could describe as the ability to make the most out of the particular cognitive services that a function provides you with. So if you're a TI user, you have a certain way of looking at the world. If you're a TI dominant, you have this way of looking at the world very often and by default. Whether or not you can make the most of that in terms of in intellectual terms, in practical terms, in deliberative terms, in conversational terms. There's a lot of variables involved, again, that will not be variables captured by Jungian systems, because they're not variables that pin down personality so much as a certain range of abilities, including intellectual abilities. But these will be whether you make the most out of your function. And that's roughly what you could then call proficiency at TI use. So in other words, you can be someone who has very, very pronounced TI preference, TI inertial preference, and defaults to TI without actually being very proficient at it, because you're not endowed with the abilities in question, but you're still very much in that TI frame of mind. Conversely, you could be an INFJ who has the abilities, again, not captured by MBTI, but nevertheless present, that are meeting the condition for making the most out of your third preference, namely TI, whenever you let to using it. Whether you use it willingly, because a task demands it, or you're led to use it because you're discussing with an INTP, for example, and the fact that they default to it leads you to also use it. There could be a little bit of an FE impact here of the INFJ, putting themselves in the sort of cognitive frame of mind of the person they're talking to. Either way, it's certainly true that you could have a discussion between an INTP and INFJ where both are using TI, and the INFJ is showing a lot more proficiency at it. Someone who concludes from this that the INFJ is really an INTP and that the INTP is maybe just really an INFJ is confusing preference with proficiency. The rank, the position that a function has in the stack, in your stack, has everything to do with preference, with inertial preference, and nothing to do with proficiency. And in fact, when I say nothing to do with proficiency, that's actually not quite true. It has nothing to do directly with proficiency. But maybe in a later video, I could try to discuss the ways in which it does have indirectly to do with proficiency, because obviously, if you have a strong preference for a function and you find yourself in a functional frame of mind a lot of the time, you will be at an advantage when it comes to developing more proficiency than someone who's much more rarely in that frame of mind. But it's indirect. The real decider in this case is preference. So let me know if this was clear, and if you guys have found this useful. Don't forget about my Patreon and about my books. And I will see you either next Sunday, if I'm publishing this on Sunday, or tomorrow, if I'm publishing this on Saturday. See you guys. Take care.